Chapter 7 Matter 1 and Antimatter 0. Paul Dirac became an important physicist during the early development of quantum mechanics. Building on Einstein's work in relativity, Dirac created a relativistic version of quantum mechanics. He noticed that the mc of the equation E equals mc squared has both positive and negative roots. The inclination in physics was to use only the positive root, but Dirac focused on the negative. He recognized he was dealing with not only positive energy, but with negative energy as well. We observe positive energy all around us, but what does negative energy mean? Dirac conceived that the real world we see is a world of positive energy. He postulated that empty space is a sea of negative energy particles. It was already known that if you give an electron positive energy, it will move up the energy ladder. This is an addition process. To Dirac, it seemed reasonable that if an electron in a sea of negative energy is given some positive energy, it could move out of the negative energy sea of empty space to become an ordinary electron. With this exit, he reasoned, a hole is left behind in the sea of negative energy. This hole acts like a positively, in reality negatively, charged particle. As in the illustration of the semiconductor again, we give the hole 0 a charge. Dirac explained that any particle can be produced by this positive energy input as long as it also produces the opposite charge. The positive energy input creates a positive energy particle, such as an electron, with a negative charge and simultaneously creates a negative energy particle with a positive charge. This is consistent with the law of conservation of charge. If Franklin had guessed right, positive and negative energy would match positive and negative charges. Instead, we require a particle to have simultaneously negative and positive attributes. Negative energy alone with a positive charge and positive energy along with a negative charge. We have created an inconsistency that leads to a misunderstanding of nature's consistency. The negative energy particle is thought to be in an antimatter state and is called an antiparticle. Every particle in a positive energy state has its opposite particle in a negative energy state known as antimatter. These have been well demonstrated by cloud chamber technology. The problem continuing to perplex the physicist is, where is the antimatter? Outside of rare glimpses of antimatter in quantum experiments, it seems to be missing and not a recognizable part of our sensory mechanisms. However, I intend to reveal antimatter as a part of the observable world. We have missed observing it because we have missed understanding the role that the geometrical whole plays as a dependent part of the physical. What is the meaning of the prefix anti in antimatter? Anti is a prefix of opposition to one thing or another. The dictionary records anti as of the same kind but situated opposite of the attached base word. The prefix anti means the opposite. Antimatter, then, is the opposite of matter. Contemporary science does not have an adequate explanation for antimatter. Physicists generally believe that both matter and its opposite antimatter have the same mass, and the most common explanation of the difference is that they are mirror images of each other. Notice how Dirac's description of antimatter as a whole in the fabric of nothing is in sharp contrast to the common view stated above that the mass of both matter and antimatter is the same. What is the greatest opposite that can be created for matter and its physical properties? The greatest opposite of matter is non-matter. The anti of something is nothing. If the non-matter of nothing is antimatter, then we can conclude that an antimatter particle is the non-matter state of being empty, which is a negative energy state. Also, a positive energy particle is in a matter state of the fill. To subtract energy is an emission of matter which brings an object, the object that emits, to the non-matter, antimatter state. This is the negative energy state. To add energy is an absorption of matter which brings an object, the object that absorbs, to a matter state. This is the positive energy state. Negative energy is energy taken away through emission, and this creates the non-matter and empty state of antimatter. The term antimatter can now be understood to be the nothing of the non-matter empty state for any object. Because science has concluded that both particles and antiparticles have the same mass, this presents an internal contradiction. If antimatter means empty, non-matter particles, then how can particles and antiparticles have the same mass? Researchers now measure mass by moving particles through electromagnetic fields. They assume that if the attraction curve toward the positive pole is the same as toward the negative pole, then antiparticles and particles must have the same mass. This is difficult to believe because the evidence shows that the negative charge, in reality positive charge, is involved with absorption of matter, and the positive charge, in reality negative charge, is involved with the emission of matter in reaching the non-matter of the antimatter state. One is a positive energy addition, plus, and the other is a negative energy subtraction, minus. The same curvature in the electromagnetic field does not mean they have the same mass. The same mass is an assumption based on the belief that cause and effect are derived only from physical origins. This parallels the belief that mass is somehow attracted to mass when the evidence shows that mass, 1, is attracted to non-mass, 0. Two particles of opposite charge cannot have the same mass if in fact one is in a filled condition and the other is in an empty condition. An empty minus negative energy particle, antiparticle electron, curves toward the electromagnetic pole that represents the filled plus condition, and the filled plus positive energy particle, electron, curves toward the electromagnetic pole with the empty minus condition. There is a 1 to 0 attraction in both examples, except that the positions of 1 plus and 0 negative minus is reversed when comparing one example with the other. The magnitude of the curve of matter and antimatter within the electromagnetic fields is the same because in each case the same 1s and 0s influence each other. The 1 plus of the electromagnetic pole attracts the 0 minus of the antimatter particle, and the 0 minus of the electromagnetic pole attracts the 1 plus of the matter particle. The curve is the same for both. The conclusion is that antimatter states for objects represent a negative energy subtraction of matter, and matter states for objects represent a positive energy addition of matter. The amount of matter involved is different for both matter and antimatter. It is interesting that Dirac's empty space, which he depicted as a sea of negative energy particles, and the charged hole created within this already empty space, do not today seem to be a part of how physicists view antimatter. How can both have the same mass if one is a hole and the other is a filled hole? With a new view of particles, where the particle with the empty 0 has a negative charge and the particle with a full 1 has a positive charge, it is unnecessary to view empty space, mass less space, as being anything more than empty. it is not necessary to invent a sea of negative energy particles, because negative energy is the nothing of empty space and the opposite of the positive energy of the something of filled space. The massless concept of space is the nothing of the organized whole that has always existed. Dirac's perspective requires only the concept of empty space. The whole of nothing is the negative energy attracting the something of positive energy. Thereby, we can get back to what is observable. A conclusion here is that filled electrons have absorbed photons and empty antimatter electrons have emitted photons. Photons represent energy and are attracted to the empty space that is part of the physical framework of the empty antimatter electron. After absorption, the antimatter, negative energy, electron reaches the filled matter state of positive energy. All we need to do is recognize that all particles fluctuate between empty matter states, antimatter, and the full matter states, matter. The emission process causes a particle to change from a positive filled state to a negative empty state known as antimatter. The absorption state changes a particle from a negative antimatter state to a positive matter state. From this we may conclude that all particles are their own antiparticles. For their own survival and viability, they and we fluctuate between both postures, matter and antimatter states. Antimatter is alive and well in nature. Why don't we see antimatter? Because we have failed to see what it represents. When experiencing starvation, we are in a severe antimatter state. Whatever our body needs and is deprived of places us in antimatter states. All empty containers are in antimatter states. The empty antimatter state attracts us to use of emission in gaining the filled matter state of absorption. Why do we not perceive more of a balance between matter and antimatter states within the atomic world? We do observe positrons and other antimatter particles during collisions created by particle accelerators. Why are antimatter particles released by these collisions? They must be part of the atom. The atom is a complex series of emission and absorption events. These are exchange processes between the states of matter, positive charges, and antimatter, negative charges. They occur around and within the nucleus. They emit and absorb using the force of repulsion and attraction. As an example, the bands that electrons occupy around the nucleus depend upon the electron's energy state. The more energy they absorb, the further the distance of their orbit from the nucleus. The electrons that occupy the outer bands have more positive energy, matter states, than the electrons closer to the nucleus, which carry more negative energy, antimatter states. As electrons around the nucleus absorb the energy of motion from photons, they move up the energy ladder from a non-matter state to a matter state. An increase of positive energy is always an addition plus process. When electrons emit energy, photons in motion, they move down the energy ladder closer to the nucleus. This is always a subtraction, minus, of energy, motion. What happens in subtraction? An empty is reached and is defined by the organized space of antimatter, non-matter. The addition of energy actually subtracts the zero of antimatter, and the subtraction of energy adds the zero of antimatter. For example, when pumping, subtracting heat, energy, out of a refrigerator, it is in more of an antimatter state. Thermodynamicists know that areas of high energy are induced to move to areas of low energy. The high energy matter state of the one is attracted to the antimatter state of the zeros of the low energy state. For the same reason, hot moves to cold. Hot is an increase of emission and absorption which creates more filled matter states and cold is a decrease of emission and absorption, which creates more empty antimatter states. Hot is the excess of a positive energy state attracted to the cold, which is a deficit of a negative energy state. Hot is the excess of the 1 attracted to the cold deficit of the 0. Hot is an excess of 1s and a deficit of 0s, while cold is an excess of 0s and a deficit of 1s. All nature oscillates and fluctuates between matter and antimatter. Oscillation creates the antimatter phase to be able to return to the matter phase of absorption. Energy is a difficult phenomenon to understand. Even knowledgeable scientists talk around it and have difficulty defining it. In a following chapter, energy will be defined for the mind, showing its relationship to matter. The entire atom is an oscillator involving emission and absorption, antimatter and matter, negative and positive, empty and fill and off and on events. In each set of these opposites, the opposite of each pair of opposites is directly related to the 0, and the other is directly related to the 1. These opposites illustrate nature's binary action. The atom is a derivative of this action, and objects created by combinations of atomic structure are based upon the same principles. Nature is a balanced symmetry of rhythmic exchanges between matter 1 and antimatter 0 states. We do not come in direct contact with atomic antimatter states because they exist within the atom's inaccessible structures. Each atomic fill is a matter state, and each atomic empty is an antimatter state. To take part any structure is to destroy its specific antimatter 0 geometry. Free electrons are in a positive matter state because they gain energy from this filled state. Absorption is a transfer of energy to the absorber, giving the absorber the energy of motion. Free electrons have absorbed enough energy to gain liftoff from the atom. Free antimatter electrons, positrons, appear to have a short existence, and their stability requires them to be part of atomic structure. This is because of less energy is in antimatter states. Many of the paradoxes of contemporary physics can be obviated by resurrecting the concept of empty space as empty. But now contemporary mathematics presents empty space as an inexhaustible supply of particles. These particles are said to pop in and out of existence from what was earlier thought to be the nothingness of empty space. These so-called particles are named virtual particles, and the moving in and out of nothing is named vacuum fluctuations. Virtual particles, however, are something less than particles. It is believed that somehow they produce the effect of a particle without being actual particles. They have now arrived at a hypothesis that does not fit observational evidence. How can virtual particles, less than real particles, come from what is already empty? In their search for explanations of nature, scientists have insisted on using the physical to explain everything. They use these virtual particles to try to explain forces between particles. For instance, the repulsive force between two electrons is explained by the change of virtual photons. This exchange of virtual photons, it is said, causes a rebound effect that results in electrons repelling each other. This is a mathematical invention used to explain the phenomenon of repulsion. Instead of building upon this contrived hypothesis of virtual particles, it is easier to view repulsion as I have shown. Repulsion effects come from 0-on-0 and 1-on-1 encounters. Repulsion occurs because an exchange, emission to absorption, cannot take place. Two free electrons are both in a filled and positive energy state. This is a one-on-one of repulsion because there is no possibility of a 1 to 0 emission reaching absorption. Why would electrons exchange the positive energy they already have and the energy necessary to be in this free state outside of the atom? This is the energy that allows their existence beyond the atom. Also, there would be a repulsion between two positrons, antimatter electrons, without the exchange of these presumed virtual particles. These two antimatter electrons create a state of zero-on-zero repulsive opposition. Similarly, the attraction for an anti-electron positron, empty, and an electron, full, for each other is due to the zero of the anti-electron positron and the 1 of the electron. However, in this case there are two zeros, one filled and one empty, with no possibility of a fill for both. The prediction here is that this is the reason for the disintegration of an anti-electron, positron, and electron when they come together. Their disintegration is a return to particles that can reach absorption for energy usage. Apparently, manageable and stable emission and absorption events for electrons are more likely to occur within atomic structure. Similarly, notice that humans are repulsed, one-on-one and zero-on-zero, by their inability to achieve absorption, 1 into 0. To explain this repulsion mechanism for humans, it is not necessary to contrive a virtual exchange process. The point is that by using the 0 and 1, attraction and repulsion forces can be explained without the need to exchange phantom particles and disrupt the beauty and simplicity of nothing. The term vacuum fluctuations need not be discarded. It can be used to describe the geometrical vacuum of nothing as it appears and disappears with the emission and absorption of matter. In John Gribben's book In Search of Schrödinger's Cat, he discusses the parity change theorem, PCT. It is the PCT theorem that is the basis of the assumption that the emission of a particle is exactly equivalent to absorption of its antiparticle counterpart. This is a startling statement for a world that is not supposed to show antiparticles. In scientific language, the word equivalent means that something is exactly the same as something else. Not just equal to something, but the same in every conceivable way. To me, this statement admits that we have misunderstood the reality of an antiparticle. Science is perplexed because it does not see what would be expected to be a balance between matter and antimatter. And yet we experience the everyday normal events of particle emission that are exactly the same as the absorption of its antiparticle counterpart. Every time there is an emission of matter, there is a simultaneous absorption of antimatter. There has been difficulty in describing antimatter. However, it is the same as the emission phase of regular matter. It is obvious to me that we have missed something of fundamental importance because the clues to understanding are unseen. Like the counting board, we have looked without seeing. This is the same time incredible and understandable. The PCT theorem that the departure of an object is the same as the arrival of an object, an antiparticle, is indeed strange. But it becomes comprehensible when we introduce the organized whole and make it a viable and necessary partner with the physical world. To perceive this, we must include both the physical of an object and the non-physical whole the object uses for absorption. For an emission phase to take place, it must be preceded by absorption. Absorption, arrival, is always prior to emission. What occurs to the object during emission? The object's prior full condition is changing to an empty condition. As the object emits a 1, the empty of the 0 emerges at the same time. The departure of something, 1, creates the arrival of nothing, 0. The departure of matter, 1, is the same as the arrival of antimatter, 0. The emission of the 1 of matter is equivalent to the absorption of the 0 of antimatter. This equivalence is now explained. The significance of non-matter, which is antimatter, has been lost precisely because it remains unseen. Non-matter, antimatter, is not obvious precisely because it is unseen. Antimatter is an organized area of non-matter. The borders giving this organized area from a form and shape to non-matter, antimatter, are defined by the physical framework of an object. In the same way, the 0 of the empty truck is an antimatter state, non-matter state, organized by the truck's physical framework. Antimatter and organized non-matter are interchangeable concepts that always require the presence of a physical framework for the 0's organization. The written symbol 0 is the antimatter of non-matter organized by the physical framework of ink that surrounds it. From the PCT theorem that the emission of a particle is equivalent to the absorption of its antiparticle counterpart, it follows that the emission of an antiparticle is equivalent to the absorption of its particle counterpart. When the absorbed particle arrives for the absorber, there is at the same time a departure of the antiparticle, 0 of no particle. As nothing departs, something arrives, or when something arrives, nothing departs. It seems incredible that nature could be so simple, but it is the principle that is simple. How matter 1 and antimatter 0 fluctuate within a structure can be complex. In contrast, the matter and non-matter of a drinking glass are a simple structure illustrating a simple principle. To fill and then empty the glass is to go from a matter state of the fill to an antimatter state of the empty. Absorption creates a matter state and emission creates an antimatter state. The principles behind our existence parallel those for the rest of nature. Within this new perspective on the presence and reality of antimatter in the universe, there is the necessary balance between matter and antimatter. Magnetic poles and electrical charges. As described toward the end of Chapter 4, objects, 1, in motion are continuously and simultaneously entering a 0 forward and emptying a 0 behind. An object 1 in motion is expressing its changing use of its field 0. Motion is an object's continuous filling and emptying of its 0 field. The 0 field used by an object's motion continuously disappears forward and reappears behind. Motion is an expression of the object changing a 0 to a 1 in front as it moves, and at the same time is changing a 1 to a 0 behind as the object is leaving. Within a magnet there is a uniform direction of atomic motion. Binary theory predicts that the magnetic north and south poles are expressions of the 1 and 0 foundation, as the 1 uses its field 0 during motion. The uniformity of direction for atomic motion within magnetic material reveals this uniform use of the field, as the 0 field disappears forward as the object fills the 0 field. As the field disappears forward, the 0 field reappears behind as the object empties the 0 field. It is a 0 changing to a 1 forward and 1 changing to a 0 behind. The north and south poles of a magnet show the uniformity of the 1 and 0 changes during motion. When atomic motion is not homogeneously directional, the 1 and 0 are random in their arrangement. This randomness of motion direction does not show the magnetic poles, as in a magnet, with their directional uniformity of the 1s and 0s. The uniform direction of motion explains the magnetic effects around a wire conducting electric current. An electric current also represents this homogeneous nature of the electron's direction of motion. The electrons being conducted within the conducting wire have the same direction of motion. This electric current, the electron's motion, is expressed by the 1 of the electron forward and the 0 of the non-electron behind. The magnetic field around the conducting wire exhibits the 1's use of its field 0 during motion. The conclusion here is that magnetic effects are related to motion. These effects are not displayed in the whole magnetic body until large amounts of motion within the body occur in the same direction. This explains the relationship of magnetic poles to electrical charges. To see this connection, it is necessary to separate position from motion. The binary magnetic poles represent a 0 and 1 during their continuous changes during motion, changing to a 1 forward and a 0 behind the 1 of the object in motion. The binary electric charges of positive and negative represent the after motion states of 0 and 1. Magnetic poles are zeros and ones expressed during motion, and electrical charges are zeros and ones expressed after motion. Binary magnetic effects are examples of the 0 and 1 usage during the emitted object's motion. Binary electrical charges are examples of the 0 negative charge of an object after its emission and the 1 positive charge of an object after its absorption. Motion is the energy used to reach the empty antimatter state of a negative charge and the full matter state of a positive charge. Charges show the positional nature of the positive fill of the matter state for an object and the negative empty of the antimatter state for another object. Magnetic poles exhibit the in-between state of motion used to reach the empty of the negative charge and the fill of the positive charge. It has never been understood why electrical charges can be separated and magnetic poles cannot be separated. The many attempts to separate magnetic poles into monopoles have been unsuccessful. This is explained by the 0 and 1 nature of magnetic poles during motion. To separate poles of a magnet is impossible because these poles represent motion. Motion cannot be divided because either motion exists or it does not. To stop motion is to stop the magnetic 0 and 1 expression during motion. The 0 and 1 continuously change during motion. Without the 1's changing use of its 0 field, there is no motion and no magnet. During positional absorption, there is no relative motion between the absorber and that which is absorbed. The continuous changes during motion have ceased. The absorbed object has entered the whole of the absorbing object, creating a non-motion relationship between them both. This non-motion relationship creates a positive filled condition for the absorbing object and a negative empty condition for the emitting object. Magnetic poles are energies motion used to reach the difference between objects and their separate positive matter states and their negative antimatter states. Electrical charges showing the part phase for the 0 and 1 are expressed by separate objects in the antimatter state, 0 of negative charge, and the matter state 1 of positive charge. Motion shows the binary 0 and 1 together phase during motion, while charges show the binary apart phase after motion. Whether they are apart after motion or are together during motion, the 0 and 1 still exhibit their interdependence. It is necessary to separate position, absorption, and motion, emission, to understand the difference between magnetic poles and electrical charges. Magnetic poles and electrical charges demonstrate the difference between emission, polar 0 and 1 magnetic effects during motion, and absorption, 0 and 1 electrical charge effects after motion. Contemporary difficulties of interpreting nature are primarily involved with the prevailing misconception that position and motion are simultaneous events. Motion demonstrates energy, wave, emission, and magnetic effects, while position demonstrates non-energy, wave cessation, absorption, and the electrical charges of positive 1 and negative 0. The cessation of motion at absorption completes the positive charge of an object's filled state, and also completes the negative charge of the empty state for another object. A positive charge always results in a negative charge.